In April 1848, 105 surviving crewmen abandoned their ice-locked ships and walked south into nothing, leaving behind a single written note, some scattered silverware, and bones that would later show signs of something unspeakable. Not one of them was ever seen alive again. What happened after those men left the ships? That question has survived for nearly 2 centuries, because the expedition never left behind a complete answer. Every discovery has narrowed the possibilities without completely closing them. And that is the strange territory we're entering now. Places where archaeology can reveal the evidence, science can test it, and history can reconstruct the circumstances, yet something essential remains just beyond reach. The expedition simply fades from documented history into a silence that has lasted for generations. And that silence is where our story begins. Beaufort Bay, King William Island, in the Canadian Arctic. Flat, wind-scoured gravel under a sky that stays lit for months and then vanishes for months. It is a place that seems to erase footprints faster than they can be left. And yet here, in 1859, a search party found a single sheet of paper tucked inside a stone cairn, the only written record ever recovered from the Franklin expedition's final months. It should have answered everything. Instead, it raised more questions than it resolved. The expedition set out from England in May 1845 with 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and 129 officers and men under the command of Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old veteran of Arctic exploration. Their mission was the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Canadian Arctic connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, sought by European navies for 3 centuries. The ships were the most advanced polar vessels of their day, reinforced with iron plating, fitted with early steam engines, and stocked with over 3 years of provisions, including thousands of tins of preserved food. By any measure, this was not a reckless voyage. It was, on paper, one of the best-equipped Arctic expeditions in history. 2 whaling ships spotted Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay that July, waiting for conditions to cross into Lancaster Sound. That sighting, on July 26, 1845, was the last time any European laid eyes on Franklin or his men alive. For 2 years, nothing. No word, no wreckage, no survivors. By 1848, the Admiralty in London began organizing search expeditions, first a trickle, then, as public alarm grew, a flood. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's wife, spent years and a considerable fortune funding search after search, refusing to let the matter rest. Over the following decade, more than 30 expeditions combed the Arctic, from British naval ships to American-funded parties to Inuit-guided search teams. What they slowly assembled was not a clear account, but a scatter of fragments, each one deepening the mystery rather than closing it. The single surviving document is the place any investigation must begin. Found in a cairn at the Victory Point, it consists of 2 messages written on the same standard Admiralty form, left a year apart. The first, dated May 1847, is almost cheerful in its brevity. All is well, the ships are icebound, Franklin is in command. The second message, squeezed into the margins around the first and dated April 25, 1848, tells a different story entirely. Franklin was dead. He had died on June 11, 1847, just weeks after the first note was written. The ships had been abandoned, stuck fast in ice for a year and a half. 9 officers and 15 men had also died. The 105 survivors, now under Captain Francis Crozier, were preparing to march south on foot toward the Canadian mainland, hundreds of miles away, hauling boats and supplies across the ice. None of them made it. Not one member of the Franklin expedition is confirmed to have survived. What happened to them along that march became the subject of Inuit oral testimony collected by searchers like John Ray in the 1850s, testimony that was, at the time, dismissed by Victorian society as unreliable, even scandalous. The Inuit accounts described groups of emaciated white men dragging boats and dying along the coastline, and they described something else: evidence on the bodies, consistent with cannibalism. British authorities and the press recoiled at the suggestion. Charles Dickens himself wrote publicly against it, arguing that English gentlemen would never resort to such an act. But in the 1980s and 1990s, forensic examinations of skeletal remains recovered from King William Island found cut marks consistent with defleshing, the kind of marks left when human bones are processed for meat. The Inuit testimony, it turned out, had been right all along. Then there's the matter of the bodies themselves. Specifically, the 3 sailors buried on Beechey Island during the expedition's first winter in 1846. Their graves were the best preserved evidence anyone had, and in 1984, anthropologist Owen Beatty exhumed them. The permafrost had mummified the men so completely that their faces, their expressions were still visible after more than a century. Tissue samples revealed extraordinarily high levels of lead, far beyond what would be expected even for the period. Where did it come from? The leading theory points to the tins of preserved food soldered with lead at a rushed, low-bid contractor's factory. Some researchers argue the lead alone could have caused confusion, weakness, and paranoia among the crew in their final months. Others push back, noting that lead exposure was common across Victorian Britain and may not fully explain what happened. The debate has not been settled, nor has the location of the ships. For over a century and a half, Erebus and Terror were among the most sought-after wrecks in maritime history. Swallowed by ice and current, their resting place unknown despite dozens of search efforts. It was not until September 2014 that Erebus was finally located, remarkably intact, on the seabed of Queen Maud Gulf. Terror was found 2 years later, in 2016, nearly 100 kilometers away, discovered, fittingly, with guidance from Inuit oral history that had pointed searchers toward the area for generations. The wrecks answered the question of where. They have not yet answered the question of why the ships ended up so far apart, or what final decisions were made aboard them in the last desperate weeks. So, the fragments sit, still not quite fitting together. A note with 2 messages, a year and a world apart. Lead in the bones of men who starved as much as they were poisoned. Cut marks that confirm what a grieving empire refused to believe. 2 ships, found at last, sitting quiet on the Arctic floor, with their final logs long since dissolved into seawater. What actually happened during those months of marching south, who made which choices, who died where and in what order, remains locked in a landscape that rarely gives up its secrets easily. The ice took detailed notes. It just isn't finished releasing them. 2 centuries would pass before the world would learn to distrust a boy who simply appeared. But on a warm May afternoon in 1828, in the cobbled quiet of Nuremberg, Germany, no one yet understood what they were looking at. He stood in the Unschlittplatz, a small square near the city's old tanning district, swaying slightly, as if uncertain the ground beneath him was real. He was perhaps 16 years old. His clothes were coarse, ill-fitting, foreign to the fashions of the town. In his hand he held a letter, addressed to a cavalry captain, written in a hand that was not his own. When townspeople approached him, he could barely speak. He repeated a few phrases, over and over, as though they were the only words he possessed. He wanted to be a writer, like his father had been. Beyond that, he seemed to understand almost nothing. Not directions, not questions, not the ordinary rhythms of human conversation. His name, he would eventually say, was Kaspar Hauser. What happened next has been picked apart by historians, physicians, and skeptics for nearly 200 years, and even now, the picture refuses to fully resolve. The verified facts are, at first, deceptively simple. Kaspar Hauser was taken in by the authorities of Nuremberg, who assumed at first that he might be a vagrant, or perhaps mentally impaired. But something about him didn't fit either explanation. He could write his own name, oddly enough, a small, isolated skill amid an otherwise total lack of education. He flinched at the bright light. He recoiled from the taste of meat, and would eat almost nothing but bread and water. His skin was pale in a way that seemed less like complexion and more like absence, the pallor of someone who had rarely, if ever, seen the sun. As authorities and curious citizens spent more time with him, Hauser began to tell a story. It emerged slowly, in fragments, as his vocabulary grew under the patient tutelage of those who took interest in his case. He said he had spent his entire remembered life in a small, darkened cell, so cramped he could not stand upright. He said he was fed only bread and water, that he saw no one, that he had 2 wooden toy horses to occupy his hands, and that occasionally, without explanation, someone would enter, clean his straw bedding, and leave again without a word. He did not know how long this had gone on. He did not know why it had ended, or why he had been deposited, without warning, in the middle of a German city with a note in his hand and almost no language to explain himself. Was this true? That question, asked in 1828 and asked still, has never received a universally accepted answer. The mainstream explanation, favored by many of Hauser's contemporaries and by a number of modern historians, is unglamorous but plausible. That Kaspar Hauser was a troubled young man, possibly with a history of neglect or institutional confinement, who fabricated or exaggerated elements of his story, whether out of delusion, a need for attention, or a search for identity in a world that had suddenly begun paying attention to him for the first time. Under this reading, the mystery of Kaspar Hauser is less a puzzle of hidden princes and secret prisons, and more a case study in how a vulnerable individual can become a canvas onto which an entire society projects its need for a story. But this explanation, however sober, does not fully account for what came next. Hauser's local celebrity, Nuremberg's Child of Europe, as some began to call him, placed him under the guardianship of a schoolteacher named Georg Friedrich Daumer, who worked to educate him and study his peculiar condition. Under Daumer's care, Hauser began to speak more fluently, to read, to reflect on his own strange history, and it was here, in October of 1829, that the case took its first violent turn. Hauser was found in a cellar, bleeding from a wound to his forehead, claiming that a hooded man had attacked him and warned him to keep silent about his origins. Some believed him. Others suspected he had inflicted the wound himself. Then, in 1833, 5 years after he had first appeared in the square, Kaspar Hauser was found in a park in Ansbach, mortally wounded, a small purse and a note nearby. The note, written in mirror script, claimed the writer's identity would remain forever unknown, even as the wound itself would eventually take Hauser's life. He died 3 days later, insisting to the end that a stranger had lured him there and stabbed him. Was it murder? Was it self-inflicted, a final desperate act by a young man who had built his entire identity around being a mystery, and feared what might happen once that mystery lost its power to captivate? The wound, medical examiners noted, was severe, arguably too severe to have been self-administered, though not impossibly so. It is here that the more speculative theories begin, the ones that gave Kaspar Hauser his enduring, almost mythic status. The most persistent claims that Hauser was, in fact, the rightful hereditary Prince of Baden, swapped as an infant with a dying child, and hidden away for decades to secure a rival line's claim to the throne. Proponents point to reported physical resemblances between Hauser and the House of Baden, to the political motives certain nobles may have had, and to the strange, almost theatrical nature of both his appearance and his death, as if someone with genuine power had reason to silence him permanently. Critics counter that royal conspiracy theories have a way of attaching themselves to any unexplained figure of the era, and that no definitive documentary evidence has ever linked Hauser conclusively to the bottom line. DNA testing, conducted more than once in the modern era on hair and blood samples attributed to Hauser, has produced results that are, fittingly, inconclusive, contested by different research teams and unable to settle the matter one way or another. What remains, after nearly 2 centuries, is a boy who appeared from nowhere in a German square, who spoke of a childhood spent in darkness, and who died or was silenced before he could ever fully explain himself. Was Kaspar Hauser a deceived innocent, a fabricator, or the hidden heir to a European throne? The historical record, frustratingly, entertains all 3 possibilities and confirms none. Perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said of him, that he arrived as a mystery and departed as one too, leaving behind only a wound, a note in mirrored handwriting, and a question that has outlived every person who might once have answered it. Some 4,000 miles west of that Nuremberg square, across an ocean that had swallowed fleets and fortunes alike, another disappearance was taking shape, one that would leave behind no note, no wound, no witness, only an empty horizon and a ship that never made port. The Atlantic, on the last day of December 1812, was not a place for the faint of heart. Along the coast of the Carolinas, storms rolled in fast and violent, churning waters that swallowed vessels whole and left no trace behind. Somewhere on that unforgiving sea sailed a small schooner named the Patriot, bound from Georgetown, South Carolina to New York City. Aboard her was a woman named Theodosia Burr Alston, daughter of Aaron Burr, former Vice President of the United States, and by every account one of the most accomplished, educated, and formidable women of her era. She was 30 years old. She was gravely ill, having recently lost her only child. She was sailing north to see her father, who had just returned from years of self-imposed exile in Europe following his infamous duel with Alexander Hamilton and his subsequent trial for treason. The Patriot set sail. And then, somewhere along that stretch of coastline, it simply vanished. No wreckage, no survivors, no bodies ever recovered. What do we actually know? The verified historical record is frustratingly thin. The Patriot departed Georgetown on December 30th or 31st, 1812, flying, according to some accounts, a black flag. A curious detail, though its significance remains debated. She carried Theodosia, a small crew, and her personal belongings, including a portrait of herself that she had commissioned, reportedly intending to present it to her father as a gift. The ship never arrived in New York. No storm log, no distress signal, no wreckage matching her description was ever confirmed. Aaron Burr waited. He wrote later that he grieved not only the loss of a daughter, but the loss of all in this world that had bound him to it. The most widely accepted explanation is also the simplest, and perhaps the least satisfying to imagine, that the Patriot was caught in one of the violent winter storms known to batter that stretch of Atlantic coastline, and was lost with all hands, her wreckage scattered and buried beneath shifting sands or dispersed by currents until nothing remained to identify her. The War of 1812 was also underway at the time, and British naval vessels patrolled these waters aggressively, meaning a storm was not the only danger the Patriot might have encountered. But if the sea simply took her, why has her disappearance endured for more than 2 centuries as one of America's most persistent maritime mysteries? Perhaps it is because the story did not end with silence. It ended instead with rumors, and rumors, unlike facts, have a way of accumulating rather than fading. The most enduring of these concerns, piracy. The waters off the Carolina coast in 1812 were no stranger to wreckers and pirates who preyed on passing vessels, and in the decades following Theodosia's disappearance, a series of unsettling claims began to surface. In the 1830s, a man reportedly confessed on his deathbed to having been part of a pirate crew that boarded the Patriot, forced her passengers to walk the plank, and scuttled the ship to erase the evidence. Similar deathbed confessions surfaced more than once in the following decades, a pattern that true crime investigators today would treat with real suspicion, given how often such stories emerge conveniently after the accused, and everyone who might contradict them, are safely beyond questioning. Then there is the matter of the portrait. Decades after Theodosia's disappearance, a woman's portrait began circulating along the North Carolina coast, said to have been recovered from a shipwreck or purchased from local fishermen who claimed it had washed ashore or been taken from a ship they'd looted. The painting depicted a woman whose features, some claimed, bore a striking resemblance to Theodosia Burr Alston. It became known in later folklore as the Nag's Head Portrait, named for the coastal community where it reportedly surfaced. Was this truly Theodosia's lost portrait, the very one she was said to be bringing to her father? Or was it simply a case of pattern-seeking minds, eager to find meaning in the face of an unrelated painting, decades after the fact? The portrait's provenance has never been conclusively established. It exists today, but the chain of ownership connecting it to the Patriot remains, at best, circumstantial, a thread that historians can trace only part way before it dissolves into folklore. From here, the theories grow more speculative still. Some coastal legends suggest Theodosia did not die at sea at all, but was captured and lived out her remaining years under a different identity, either by choice or by force. A woman erased from her own life and reinvented as someone else entirely, her true story buried beneath the waves of a false one. Others point to reports, unverified and inconsistently documented, of skeletal remains found along the Outer Banks in the years following her disappearance, remains that some speculated, without proof, might belong to Theodosia or her crew. None of these threads resolve into certainty. Each one, examined closely, dissolves back into the same fog that has surrounded this case since the winter of 1813. What we are left with, in the end, is a woman of remarkable intellect and resilience, sailing north through dangerous waters to reunite with a father whose own life had been defined by scandal and reinvention, and a ship that never arrived. No wreckage confirmed. No burial, no final words, save the ones we imagine for her. Did Theodosia Burr Alston perish in a violent Atlantic storm, one of countless ships lost to the sea's indifferent power? Did pirates board the Patriot in those final hours, leaving behind nothing but a black flag and a legend? Or does some fragment of her still exist, in a portrait of uncertain origin, hanging today far from where it was said to be found? Its true story as unrecoverable as the woman it may, or may not, depict. The Atlantic keeps its silence, and more than 200 years later, the sea off the Carolina coast has never given up its answer. A ship's silence had swallowed one mystery. Now, a different kind of silence, the silence of a locked room, a single gunshot heard in the dark, and a story that changed depending on who was telling it, would swallow another. The Natchez Trace, in the autumn of 1809, was one of the loneliest roads in America. Carved through dense Tennessee wilderness, it connected the Mississippi River to Nashville, a narrow dirt path flanked by thick forest, prone to robbery, and dotted with a handful of rough wilderness inns known as stands. One of these, Grinder's Stand, was little more than 2 small log cabins and a barn, run by a woman named Priscilla Grinder, standing in a clearing surrounded by wilderness on all sides. It was here, on the night of October 10, 1809, that Meriwether Lewis, the very man who, alongside William Clark, had led the most celebrated expedition in early American history, met his end. At the time of his death, Lewis was 35 years old. He had crossed a continent, mapped uncharted rivers, negotiated with dozens of native nations, and survived hardships that killed lesser men. He had returned from the Pacific a national hero, been appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory by his friend and mentor Thomas Jefferson, and seemed by every outward measure destined for a long and distinguished career in the young republic's service. And yet, by the autumn of 1809, something had changed. The verified facts tell us this much: Lewis had fallen into serious financial and political trouble. Expense vouchers he had submitted to the federal government for expedition-related costs were being challenged by officials in Washington, threatening him with personal financial ruin. Friends and colleagues who saw him in the months before his death described a man who seemed distracted, erratic, at times deeply melancholic. He was traveling to Washington, D.C. to defend himself and his reputation, carrying with him papers, journals, and documents of considerable importance, some related to the expedition, some to his official duties as governor. He stopped for the night at Grinder's stand, and according to Priscilla Grinder's own account, the only direct witness testimony that survives, Lewis behaved strangely from the moment he arrived. He paced. He talked to himself. He refused food, then asked for it, then refused it again. Sometime after midnight, she reported hearing gunshots, followed by the sound of a body falling, and Lewis's voice calling out for help. By the time anyone reached him, he was severely wounded, shot, by most accounts, in the head and the torso. He lingered for several hours before dying as the sun rose over the wilderness. The mainstream historical conclusion, endorsed early on by both Thomas Jefferson and William Clark, men who knew Lewis intimately, was suicide. They pointed to his documented struggles with what modern observers might describe as depression, his financial desperation, and a family history that reportedly included other instances of mental instability. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, this explanation stood largely unchallenged, taught in textbooks as a tragic postscript to an otherwise triumphant American story. But does it fully account for what was found and not found at the scene? Here is where the case grows more difficult to resolve. Several details do not sit comfortably within the suicide narrative. Lewis was reportedly shot more than once, a method considered unusual, though not impossible, for self-inflicted wounds of the era. Witnesses at the scene noted that some of his personal effects, and possibly portions of his official papers, appeared to be missing or disturbed. Priscilla Grinder's own account of that night shifted in certain details across multiple retellings over the following years, leaving historians to wonder whether she was an unreliable narrator, a frightened witness reluctant to share everything she knew, or something else entirely. This uncertainty has, over the past 2 centuries, given rise to a persistent counter-theory that Meriwether Lewis was murdered. Proponents of the murder theory point to several threads. The Natchez Trace was known to be frequented by robbers, and Lewis was carrying valuable papers and cash at the time of his death. Others have suggested a political motive, noting Lewis's access to sensitive government documents and his entanglement in territorial disputes that had made him enemies in Louisiana's contentious frontier politics. A small number of researchers have gone further still, floating the possibility that his death was connected to conflicts over land, expedition credit, or debts owed to him, motives that would have given more than one party reason to want him silenced before he reached Washington. Modern forensic reconstruction has done little to settle the matter. Some physicians who have reviewed the accounts of his wounds argue they are consistent with suicide, however unusual. Others maintain the pattern is more consistent with an attack. In 1996, some of Lewis's descendants petitioned for his remains to be exhumed from their resting place near the Natchez Trace, hoping modern forensic techniques might finally resolve the question. The request was denied, and to this day, Meriwether Lewis remains buried beneath a broken column monument, a design chosen deliberately, some say, to symbolize a life cut short before its time. What remains, then, is a wilderness inn, a single surviving witness whose story never quite settled into a fixed shape, and a national hero who died in the dark, far from the rivers and mountains that had made him famous. Did Meriwether Lewis, burdened by debt, isolation, and a mind perhaps fraying under pressures history has only partially recorded, take his own life on that lonely stretch of road? Or did someone else, a robber, a political enemy, or someone whose name has been lost entirely to time, ensure that he never reached Washington to tell his side of the story? More than 2 centuries later, the broken column still stands, and the wilderness around Grinder's Stand keeps whatever else it might know: papers. In the Lewis case, they were the detail no one could quite account for. Documents that may or may not have vanished alongside a dying man in a wilderness cabin. Half a world away, and only weeks apart on the calendar of history, another set of papers would go missing alongside another man entirely, this time a British diplomat, in the heart of Napoleonic Europe. The town of Perleberg, in the German region of Brandenburg, was a modest way station in November of 1809. A scattering of stone buildings and coaching inns along a well-traveled route, the kind of place travelers pass through without expecting to be remembered by it. Yet it was here, in the courtyard of the Golden Crown Inn, that Benjamin Bathurst, a British diplomat returning home from a sensitive mission in Vienna, stepped out into the cold November evening to check on the horses being harnessed to his carriage, and was never seen again. The facts, as far as they can be verified, are almost unbearably ordinary, right up until the moment they aren't. Bathurst was 32 years old, an envoy who had been sent to the Austrian court to help coordinate resistance against Napoleon's advancing empire. His mission had been dangerous by nature. Europe was a continent at war, and British agents moving through territories aligned with, or occupied by France, did so under constant risk of capture. By the time Bathurst began his return journey in November 1809, he had reason to believe he was being watched. He reportedly grew increasingly anxious as he traveled, at one point disguising himself and traveling under a false name, fearful that French agents were tracking his movements. He arrived in Perleberg in the early evening. He ate dinner. He arranged for fresh horses to continue his journey after dark, a decision some later saw as reckless, given his evident fear of pursuit. And then, sometime around 9 in the evening, while the horses were being prepared just steps from the inn's entrance, Benjamin Bathurst walked around to the front of his carriage and disappeared in the space of what witnesses estimated to be only a few minutes. No cry was heard, no struggle was reported. His traveling servant, waiting nearby, noticed nothing unusual until he realized Bathurst simply was not where he should have been. A search began almost immediately, and it turned up remarkably little. His hat and part of his overcoat were found some distance away, near a garrison building, though accounts differ on the exact location and condition in which they were discovered. Some later reports mention bullet holes in the coat. Others dispute this detail entirely, and no definitive contemporary documentation confirms it. His diplomatic papers, the very documents he had been so anxious to protect, were, according to some sources, never recovered at all, though here again, the historical record is inconsistent, muddied by decades of retelling. What does the mainstream explanation offer? Most historians point to the obvious geopolitical context. Bathurst was a British agent operating in territory sympathetic to Napoleonic France. carrying information valuable enough to justify covert action against him. Under this reading, Bathurst was almost certainly captured and likely killed by French agents or their local collaborators, who had been tracking his movements for some time and used the brief, unguarded moment outside the inn to seize him. His body, under this theory, may have been disposed of quickly and quietly, precisely because his identity and his cargo made a public arrest too diplomatically risky to attempt. It is a plausible explanation. Espionage of this kind was not uncommon in this period of European history, and Napoleon's intelligence networks were known to operate with ruthless efficiency. But does it fully explain the near-total absence of evidence? Would trained agents, capable of abducting a man in a matter of minutes without a single witnessed struggle, really have left behind a hat and coat in plain view, as if inviting suspicion rather than avoiding it? Efforts made by Bathurst's own family deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. His wife personally traveled to Perleberg the following year, hiring investigators and even receiving support from Prussian authorities to search local properties. Rumors circulated for years that Bathurst's remains had been found, buried beneath the floor of a nearby house, according to one persistent story from the 1850s, when human bones were reportedly uncovered during renovations. Whether these remains were ever definitively linked to Bathurst has never been established with certainty, and the story exists today more as local legend than as confirmed forensic history. From here, as with so many mysteries of this kind, the speculation begins to widen. Some have suggested Bathurst was not captured at all, but instead orchestrated his own disappearance, perhaps overwhelmed by the psychological strain of operating undercover in hostile territory and choosing to vanish into a new identity rather than continue a mission he no longer had the will to complete. Others have proposed something stranger still, that Bathurst's disappearance was simply too fast, too clean, too devoid of evidence to fit comfortably within any ordinary explanation, a detail that, over the ensuing 2 centuries, has occasionally attracted those drawn to the more unconventional edges of unexplained history, who point to the case as one of the era's most complete vanishings, a man who seemed to step out of his own story mid-sentence. No confirmed grave exists. No definitive confession, French or otherwise, has ever surfaced in the archives of the period. What remains is a coat, a hat, a courtyard in Perleberg, and a silence that has now lasted well over 200 years. Was Benjamin Bathurst captured and killed by agents of an empire desperate to protect its secrets? Did the pressures of his own dangerous work finally catch up to him in some other, quieter way? Or does the truth of that November evening remain exactly where it fell in 1809, scattered, incomplete, and just out of reach, somewhere between a hitched carriage and a door that was never seen to close? The sound of a heavy door, bolted shut from the outside. A single barred window. The scrape of footsteps in a corridor and then silence. That sound belonged, in the autumn of 1826, to a small jail in Canandaigua, New York, and to a man named William Morgan, who sat inside it, waiting to learn who, exactly, had put him there and why. Morgan was, by most contemporary descriptions, an unremarkable man before that autumn, a stonemason and bricklayer in his early 50s, who had drifted between towns in New York State, struggling with debt and inconsistent work. What set him apart, and what would ultimately make his name known across the entire country, was a decision he made sometime in 1826 to publish a book exposing the secret rituals, oaths, and internal workings of the Freemasons, a fraternal organization to which Morgan claimed to have once belonged, though even this detail has been disputed by historians ever since. Freemasonry, in early 19th century America, was not the fringe curiosity it is sometimes imagined as today. It was a powerful, deeply embedded institution, counting among its members judges, sheriffs, newspaper editors, and legislators across the country. Its rituals were meant to remain strictly confidential, bound by oaths members swore upon joining. When word spread that William Morgan intended to publish those secrets in a book, reactions from local Masonic lodges were swift, and by several credible accounts, increasingly hostile. The verified historical record shows a clear pattern of escalation in the weeks before Morgan vanished. His print shop was targeted by a suspicious fire. He was arrested multiple times on minor, seemingly manufactured charges, first for an alleged unpaid debt, then for allegedly stealing a shirt and tie, charges that were dropped almost as quickly as they were filed, but which conveniently kept Morgan cycling in and out of custody during the exact period his manuscript was nearing publication. On September 11, 1826, Morgan was arrested once again, this time in Canandaigua, on the original debt charge. He was briefly jailed, then released after someone unknown paid off his debt on his behalf. A detail that struck observers at the time as strange, since Morgan had no obvious benefactor. Witnesses reported seeing him leave the jail that evening in the company of several men, forced, some said, into a waiting carriage. He was reportedly heard shouting for help as the carriage pulled away into the darkness. He was never seen again. What followed was one of the largest missing persons investigations in the young country's history. The carriage was tracked along a documented route stretching roughly 100 miles west toward Fort Niagara, on the shore of Lake Ontario. Witnesses along the way reported seeing a man matching Morgan's description, apparently restrained, in the company of several other men. The trail ended at the fort itself, where Morgan was reportedly held for several days in a powder magazine before disappearing from the historical record entirely. The most widely accepted explanation, then and now, holds that Morgan was abducted by a group of Freemasons determined to prevent the publication of his exposé, and that he was ultimately murdered, his body disposed of in the waters of Lake Ontario to eliminate any evidence. This theory gained enough traction that it sparked a genuine national political movement, the Anti-Masonic Party, one of the first third parties in American history, which rose directly out of public outrage over Morgan's disappearance, and briefly became a serious force in American elections during the late 1820s and early 1830s. Several men were eventually tried in connection with Morgan's abduction. A handful were convicted, but only on the relatively minor charge of kidnapping, since no body was ever recovered and no one was ever charged with, let alone convicted of, his murder. The sentences handed down were notably light, ranging from a few months to about 2 years, a leniency that fueled public suspicion that local courts and juries, many of whose members had Masonic ties themselves, were unwilling to pursue the matter with real force. And this is where the story, like so many before it, begins to fracture into competing narratives. Roughly a year after Morgan's disappearance, a badly decomposed body washed ashore on the coast of Lake Ontario and was initially identified by Morgan's own wife as her missing husband. For a brief period, it seemed the mystery had reached its grim conclusion, but the identification was quickly challenged. The body was soon re-examined and instead identified as that of a different missing man, Timothy Monroe, whose own family came forward with matching evidence. The case became so tangled that one newspaper editor of the era remarked, with dark humor, that the corpse was a good enough Morgan until after the election, implying that anti-Masonic politicians had a vested interest in keeping the identification unresolved for as long as it served their cause. From here, the more speculative theories take hold. Some accounts from the period claim Morgan was not killed at all, but was secretly transported out of the country, paid off, and resettled somewhere far from New York to live out his remaining years under a new identity, in exchange for his silence. Reported sightings of a man resembling Morgan surfaced for years afterward in places as distant as Smyrna, in the Ottoman Empire, and various towns across Canada. though none of these sightings were ever conclusively verified, and each one, examined closely, tends to dissolve into rumor rather than solidify into fact. No remains definitively belonging to William Morgan have ever been recovered. No confession naming a final resting place has ever surfaced. What survives is a documented trail of arrests, a carriage ride into the dark, a powder magazine at a lakeside fort, and a political movement born entirely from the shadow of his absence. Was William Morgan murdered by men sworn to protect secrets he threatened to reveal? Did he vanish willingly into a new life, funded by those eager to see him gone? Or does some final answer still lie beneath the waters of Lake Ontario, as unreachable now as it was on the night that carriage disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the sound of a door closing and a silence that has never quite been broken, long before William Morgan's disappearance ignited a political movement in America? Another vanishing had already gripped Europe, one involving not a stonemason exposing secret oaths, but a child born into the most scrutinized family on the continent, whose very existence had become a matter of revolutionary politics. His name was Louis Charles, and by the laws of a monarchy already collapsing around him, he was, for a brief and haunted moment, the King of France. The Temple, a fortified medieval tower in the heart of Paris, was not built to hold a child. Its thick stone walls, its narrow windows, its heavy iron-barred doors had been designed centuries earlier for entirely different purposes. But in the summer of 1793, it was here that 8-year-old Louis Charles, son of the executed King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, herself awaiting the same fate, was held in isolation by the revolutionary government of France, separated from his surviving family, and placed under the guardianship of a shoemaker named Antoine Simon, tasked with erasing the boy's royal identity entirely. What followed, according to verified historical accounts, was a slow and deliberate destruction. Louis Charles was reportedly subjected to harsh treatment, forced to renounce his family, and, according to some documented testimony, coerced into signing statements accusing his own mother of unspeakable abuse, testimony historians widely regard today as fabricated under extreme duress, used to help justify her execution. After Simon's guardianship ended in early 1794, the boy was left largely alone in a sealed room, with minimal human contact, his physical and mental condition reportedly deteriorating with each passing month. By the time officials finally checked on him with any regularity in the final months of his recorded life, witnesses described a child who had stopped speaking almost entirely, who showed signs of severe illness, and who bore little resemblance to the boy who had entered the temple less than 2 years earlier. On June 8, 1795, French authorities announced that Louis Charles, not yet 10 years old, had died of tuberculosis within the temple prison. An autopsy was performed. His heart was reportedly removed by the attending physician, Philippe Jean Pelletan, in keeping with a practice not entirely uncommon at the time. And this small, seemingly minor detail would go on to anchor one of the most persistent royal mysteries in European history. Because almost immediately, rumors began to circulate that the child who died in the temple that June was not Louis Charles at all. The mainstream historical position, supported by the official 1795 death certificate, and reinforced much later by modern forensic science, holds that the boy who died in the temple was indeed the former Dauphin, and that his death, while tragic and clearly hastened by cruelty and neglect, was not the result of a substitution or an escape, but simply the grim outcome of the conditions to which the revolutionary government had subjected him. This conclusion draws considerable weight from DNA testing conducted in the year 2000 on the preserved heart, which had passed through a series of collectors over the preceding 2 centuries before eventually being returned to the French royal crypt at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The genetic material was compared against samples from Marie Antoinette's family, and the results were reported as consistent with a maternal relation. Evidence that many historians consider close to definitive. And yet, does definitive scientific testimony fully account for why, in the decades following his death, more than 100 separate individuals across Europe and even into North America came forward, at various points, claiming to be the escaped Dauphin of France? These pretenders, as history has come to call them, ranged from opportunistic con artists to individuals who seemed, by the accounts of those who met them, genuinely and unwaveringly convinced of their own royal identity. Some were quickly dismissed. Others gained surprisingly serious followings. The most notable among them, a clockmaker named Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, arrived in Paris in 1833 claiming to be the surviving Louis Charles, and managed to convince a number of individuals who had actually known the royal family in life, including, by some accounts, the boy's own former tutor. Naundorff pursued legal recognition of his claim for years, and after his death, his descendants continued advocating for his identity well into the 20th century, some of them even successfully petitioning, in later legal proceedings, to have the surname de Bourbon legally attached to their family name. If the DNA evidence from the preserved heart is accurate, then Naundorff, and every other claimant like him, was mistaken, whether through delusion or deliberate deception. But this raises its own quieter question. Why did the story of a switched or smuggled Dauphin take hold so powerfully and persist for so long across so many different individuals in an era without mass media to spread and sustain such a claim? Was it simply the natural human instinct to imagine that a suffering child might have been spared, projected onto a tragedy too painful to accept in its plainest form? Or does the sheer number and persistence of these claims suggest something about the historical record that has never been fully resolved? Some lingering irregularity in how the boy's final months were documented, guarded, and reported by a revolutionary government that had every political incentive to ensure the story ended cleanly. The heart itself now rests in the royal crypt at Saint-Denis, alongside the remains of the family it once, in some form, belonged to. The temple prison that held Louis Charles no longer stands. It was demolished in the early 19th century, torn down, some suggested at the time, specifically to prevent it from becoming a shrine to royalist sympathy. Was the boy who died in that sealed room in 1795 truly the last king of a fallen dynasty, worn down by neglect until his small body simply gave out? Or did something else occur within those stone walls during the 2 years the world was told almost nothing about him? Some substitution, some negotiated escape, lost now to the same silence that swallowed so much else during those revolutionary years. Science has offered its answer. History, it seems, has never quite stopped asking the question anyway. Every era, it seems, produces at least one grave that refuses to stay quiet. A name withheld, a story half told, left for later generations to puzzle over. We have followed several such graves already. Now we arrive at perhaps the most quietly haunting of them all. A headstone in Virginia that identifies its occupant only as a stranger. St. Paul's Episcopal Cemetery sits in the heart of Old Town Alexandria, Virginia. Its weathered stones arranged beneath old trees in a pattern that has changed little since the early 19th century. Among its graves stands one that draws visitors more than almost any other in the cemetery. Not because of who is known to be buried there, but precisely because of who is not. The headstone reads, in part, "To the memory of a female stranger, whose mortal sufferings terminated on the 14th day of October 1816. It goes on, in the ornate language of the period, to describe a life of virtue cut short, urging the reader to remember that wisdom, beauty, virtue ultimately give way to death. nowhere on the stone does a name appear. Nowhere is her origin explained. The verified facts surrounding her death are sparse, but consistent across the historical record. In the early autumn of 1816, a young couple arrived in Alexandria by ship, taking a room at Gadsby's Tavern, a well-known establishment that still stands today as a historic site. The woman was gravely ill upon arrival, and her male companion, who identified himself only by a request for absolute discretion, immediately summoned the city's most respected physician, Dr. William Turner, to attend to her. According to Dr. Turner's later account, the man who had brought her to Alexandria was desperate, almost frantic, in his insistence that no one learn her identity. He reportedly begged the physician, the tavern keeper, and anyone else who came into contact with the dying woman to keep her circumstances entirely confidential, offering considerable sums of money to ensure their silence. Despite Dr. Turner's efforts, the woman's condition continued to decline, and she died several weeks after arriving in the city, attended in her final hours only by her companion and the small circle of townspeople sworn to secrecy. What happened next only deepened the mystery. The unnamed man arranged for an elaborate funeral, requesting a fine casket and a formal ceremony that seemed strikingly disproportionate to a couple who had arrived in town as complete unknowns, with no stated family, occupation, or history. He commissioned the now famous headstone, reportedly composing its melancholy epitaph himself, and then, according to the most widely repeated account, left Alexandria shortly after the burial, promising to return the following year to settle outstanding debts related to the funeral. Historical records suggest he never came back. Some accounts claim he was later found dead himself in mysterious circumstances before he could return. Others simply note that he vanished from the historical record entirely, his identity, like hers, never established. Why such secrecy for a woman whose death, on its surface, appears to have been simply the result of illness? This is the question that has kept the case alive for more than 2 centuries. The more grounded historical theories tend to focus on questions of social reputation. Some historians have suggested the woman may have belonged to a prominent family, and that her death, under circumstances the family considered scandalous or embarrassing, prompted whoever accompanied her to protect both her identity and theirs from public scrutiny, choosing anonymity over the risk of disgrace. Others propose a simpler explanation, that the couple may have eloped against the wishes of disapproving families, and that the secrecy was less about scandal than about a young man's desperate, grief-stricken attempt to shield the woman he loved from a family that had rejected their union even in death. But should we take the more elaborate theories at face value, given how little verifiable evidence supports them? Over the decades, more speculative claims have accumulated around the grave, as they often do around cases defined primarily by absence rather than evidence. Some 19th century writers propose that the woman may have been connected to a prominent European or even royal family, sent to America under a cloud of political or personal disgrace. Others suggested she might have been involved in a fraud or financial scheme gone wrong. Her companion's frantic secrecy less an act of love than an act of self-preservation. None of these theories have ever been substantiated by contemporary documentation, and most historians today regard them as later embellishments, added to a story that was already compelling enough without them. Local legend in Alexandria has also long held that the grave is haunted, with visitors over the generations reporting an unexplained cold sensation near the headstone, or describing a faint, unaccountable feeling of sorrow that seems to settle over the site regardless of the season or weather. Such accounts, of course, resist any kind of historical verification, existing instead in that particular space between folklore and personal experience that surrounds so many old and unexplained graves. What we are left with, in the end, is a headstone that has stood in that Alexandria churchyard for more than 200 years. Its epitaph offering grief and reverence in place of the one detail every gravestone is expected to provide. No name, no family record, no explanation that has ever satisfied every question the case raises. Who was the female stranger of Alexandria? Was she the daughter of a family too proud or too ashamed to claim her in death? Was her companion a grieving husband, a desperate lover, or someone with far more to hide than a broken heart? The tavern where she died still stands. The grave where she rests still draws visitors searching for an answer the stone itself has never offered, and, more than 2 centuries on, may never offer at all. From the quiet churchyard of Alexandria, Virginia, we travel now across an ocean, then further still, south, past the equator, into the remote and windswept waters of the South Atlantic, to an island so isolated that its very remoteness was, in itself, considered a form of imprisonment. St. Helena is little more than a volcanic speck in the vast South Atlantic, roughly 200 miles from the nearest coastline of Africa and nearly 2,000 miles from South America. In the early 19th century, it was considered one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, which is precisely why British authorities chose it, in 1815, as the final place of exile for Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had, only a decade earlier, commanded most of continental Europe. He was housed at Longwood House, a converted farm building retrofitted to serve as a residence, damp, poorly ventilated, and by numerous contemporary accounts, unhealthy in ways that concerned even his British overseers. Napoleon spent nearly 6 years there, guarded closely, his movements restricted, his correspondence monitored, his once vast ambitions reduced to walks around a modest garden, and long hours dictating memoirs to the handful of loyal companions who had followed him into exile. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House. He was 51 years old. The verified historical facts describe a slow, painful decline in the months preceding his death. He suffered from severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and a progressive weakening that left him largely bedridden in his final weeks. An autopsy was performed the following day, attended by several physicians, including his personal doctor, Francesco Antomarchi, along with British medical officers present on the island. The official cause of death recorded was stomach cancer, a diagnosis that seemed consistent with the autopsy's documented findings of a large gastric lesion and one that aligned with a family history that included his own father's death from what was believed to be the same disease. For well over a century, stomach cancer remained the broadly accepted explanation, taught as settled historical fact. But does an official autopsy, conducted under the close supervision of the very government that had held Napoleon prisoner for 6 years, fully close the question of how he died? In the 1960s, a Swedish toxicologist named Sten Forsjövud began re-examining the case with new eyes, focusing on the detailed, contemporaneous accounts of Napoleon's symptoms recorded by those who attended him in his final years. Forsjövud noted a cluster of symptoms, including gastrointestinal distress, restlessness, insomnia, and increasing weakness, that he believed were more consistent with prolonged arsenic poisoning than with cancer. His interest led to forensic testing on samples of Napoleon's hair, preserved by loyal attendants and passed down through private collections over the decades. Multiple independent studies since then have detected arsenic levels in these hair samples significantly higher than what would be expected under normal circumstances. This finding electrified both historians and conspiracy theorists alike, and the resulting arsenic poisoning theory has remained one of the most debated alternative explanations for Napoleon's death ever since. Proponents point to several potential suspects with plausible motive, most notably the Comte de Montauban. one of Napoleon's closest companions in exile, who managed his finances, controlled access to his food and wine, and stood to benefit both financially and politically from Napoleon's death, given his documented royalist sympathies and rumored resentment toward the exiled emperor. But the arsenic theory, compelling as it may initially appear, has not gone unchallenged. Later, researchers have pointed out that elevated arsenic levels were extremely common in the early 19th century, present in wallpaper dyes, medicines, hair tonics, and even the pigments used in fabric and paint, meaning trace arsenic in preserved hair samples does not necessarily indicate deliberate poisoning at all. Longwood House itself was known to be decorated with green wallpaper containing arsenic-based pigment, commonly used at the time, which some researchers argue could account for chronic, low-level environmental exposure entirely independent of any malicious intent. More recent studies, drawing on the original detailed autopsy notes and modern medical analysis, have largely reaffirmed the original stomach cancer diagnosis, with some researchers going further still to suggest Napoleon may have been suffering from a bleeding gastric ulcer that, combined with treatments common to the era, many of which ironically contained arsenic-based compounds, may have accelerated his decline without amounting to intentional poisoning at all. Where does this leave us? With two competing scientifically supported explanations, each drawing on the same limited body of physical evidence, each interpreted differently depending on which details researchers choose to weigh most heavily. It is a case, perhaps more than any other in this exploration, where the science itself remains genuinely divided. Napoleon's body was eventually exhumed in 1840 and returned to France, where it now rests beneath an elaborate tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, a monument befitting the emperor he once was, rather than the isolated, ailing prisoner he became in his final years on that remote island. Did Napoleon Bonaparte succumb naturally to the same disease that killed his father, his body finally giving out after years of confinement and declining health? Or did someone within his own inner circle, whether acting alone or on behalf of political interests far beyond that isolated island, ensure that the emperor who had once reshaped an entire continent would never again leave St. Helena alive? More than 200 years later, the wallpaper has long since been removed. The house has been restored as a museum, and the question, like so many before it in this exploration, remains exactly where the last physicians left it, unresolved and quietly persistent. 3 decades before an emperor lay dying on a remote South Atlantic island, another figure whose fame had already outgrown ordinary explanation lay dying in a modest apartment in Vienna. His final months haunted, by his own account, by a stranger in gray and a piece of music he believed he was writing for his own funeral. Vienna, in the closing weeks of 1791, was a city accustomed to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's presence. By the age of 35, he had already composed an almost unimaginable body of work: symphonies, operas, concertos, chamber music, that had established him as one of the most gifted composers Europe had ever produced. He lived with his wife, Constanze, and their surviving children in a modest apartment. His finances often strained despite his talent, his health, by the autumn of that year, increasingly and visibly fragile. The verified historical facts describe a rapid and severe decline. In the summer of 1791, Mozart had been secretly approached by a stranger requesting, on behalf of an anonymous patron, a requiem mass, a musical setting for the dead. He accepted the commission, though those close to him later recalled that the request seemed to unsettle him deeply, feeding into a growing conviction that he was writing the piece for his own death, rather than for a stranger's. He continued composing through the autumn, even as his health worsened, his body swelling, his strength failing, his hands reportedly too weak by late November to continue writing the requiem himself, forcing him to dictate portions of it to a student. On December 5, 1791, Mozart died in his apartment, with the Requiem still unfinished, the manuscript ending mid-composition, in a passage many have since found difficult not to read as unintentionally, hauntingly symbolic. The mainstream medical explanation, supported by the majority of modern historians and physicians who have studied the documented symptoms, points to natural causes, most likely acute rheumatic fever, a condition Mozart appears to have suffered from repeatedly throughout his life, which in its final most severe episode led to kidney failure and death. This diagnosis aligns closely with contemporary accounts of his symptoms: the swelling, the fever, the pain, the gradual and consistent physical collapse that unfolded over roughly 2 weeks. And yet, does a plausible medical explanation fully account for the rumor that took hold almost immediately after his death, and has never fully released its grip on the public imagination since? Within days of Mozart's passing, whispers began to circulate throughout Vienna that he had been poisoned, and the name most persistently attached to those whispers was Antonio Salieri, an older established composer at the Habsburg court, who was widely believed at the time to harbor deep professional jealousy toward Mozart's extraordinary and effortless-seeming talent. The rivalry between the two men was real, documented in court records and personal correspondence of the era, though historians largely agree it has been considerably exaggerated by later dramatization. Still, the rumor proved remarkably durable. Decades later, in his own old age and declining mental state, Salieri was reported by some witnesses to have confessed to poisoning Mozart, though other accounts from the same period insist he denied it explicitly and repeatedly, even expressing distress at the mere suggestion. Modern medical historians examining Mozart's documented symptoms have generally found them inconsistent with the two most commonly proposed poisons of the era, mercury and arsenic, whose effects on the body typically differ in duration and character from what was recorded during his final illness. Most contemporary scholarship considers the Salieri poisoning theory a compelling piece of period folklore, rather than a medically supported explanation, though it must be acknowledged that no forensic examination of Mozart's remains has ever been possible, since his body, in keeping with the common burial practices of the time for those without significant wealth, was interred in an unmarked communal grave, its exact location lost within years of his death. This absence, a genius of his stature buried without a marker, his precise resting place unknown to history itself, has struck many, then and now, as one of the strangest details in the entire case. Should a man capable of composing works still performed in concert halls across the world more than 2 centuries later have vanished, physically, so completely and so quickly? Beyond the Salieri theory, more speculative explanations have surfaced over the years, including claims that Mozart was murdered by rivals within the Freemasons, an organization he belonged to and whose secrets some believed he had incorporated, perhaps carelessly, into his opera The Magic Flute. Others have proposed that his death resulted from complications of long-term medical treatments common in the period, treatments that frequently included mercury-based compounds administered by well-meaning physicians attempting to treat entirely unrelated ailments, meaning his death may have been hastened not by malice, but by the medical practices of his own era. The unfinished Requiem, meanwhile, was completed after Mozart's death by his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr, working from sketches and instructions Mozart had reportedly left behind. It remains one of the most performed works in the classical repertoire, its origins forever entangled with the death of the man who began it, and never finished it. Was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart simply the victim of a common and cruel illness of his era, one that claimed a rare genius the same way it claimed countless others history never remembered? Or did jealousy, secrecy, or something else entirely reach into that modest Vienna apartment during the final weeks of 1791? More than 2 centuries later, the grave that might have offered answers was never marked. The requiem was never finished by the hand that began it, and the question of what, precisely, took Mozart from the world remains, like his final composition, incomplete. A body without a grave. A name lost to history within years of a death everyone claimed to have witnessed. That same unsettling absence, a life that seems to end in the historical record while perhaps continuing somewhere just out of view, surfaces again in an earlier decade aboard a ship that never reached its destination. The Caribbean Sea, in the summer of 1788, was a crossing point for young women of colonial French families being sent home to complete their education in France, a journey considered routine, even tedious, by the standards of the era. Among these travelers was a teenage girl named Aimée du Bouc de Rivéry, born on the French island of Martinique to a prominent Creole planter family, distantly related, by several documented accounts, to Joséphine de Beauharnais, the woman who would later become Empress of France as the wife of Napoleon Bonaparte. Aimée boarded a ship bound for France to continue her convent education. According to the most widely cited version of events, the vessel never arrived. Somewhere in the waters between the Caribbean and the French coast, the ship simply disappeared from the historical record, and with it, the young girl who had boarded it. The verified facts here are notably thin, a reality historians studying this case have had to contend with directly. There is no surviving, confirmed shipping manifest definitively proving Aimée boarded a specific named vessel on a specific date. There is no documented wreck matching her voyage, no contemporary French administrative record confirming her fate one way or another. What exists, instead, is an absence. A young woman from a well-documented family who appears in colonial records up to a certain point, and then simply does not appear again. This absence alone would likely have faded quietly into genealogical footnotes, one of countless unremarkable losses at sea during an era when ocean crossings carried genuine, constant risk. But it did not fade. Instead, a remarkable legend grew around it, one that would eventually connect a Martinique convent girl to the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The story, as it developed over the following decades, claims that Aimé's ship was captured, not lost, seized by Barbary corsairs operating in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, a genuine and well-documented threat to shipping during this period. According to this account, Aimée was taken captive and eventually transported to Algiers, where she was presented as a gift to the Ottoman Sultan, ultimately entering the imperial harem in Constantinople. There, the legend continues, she was given a new name, Nakshidil, and rose to become one of the most influential women in the Ottoman court, eventually becoming the mother of a future sultan, Mahmud II, whose reign would introduce a series of significant reforms to the empire. Is this true? Here, mainstream historical scholarship grows notably cautious, even skeptical. Ottoman court records from this period, while extensive in many respects, do not offer definitive documentary proof connecting Nakshidil Sultan directly to Aimée du Bouc de Rivéry. The timeline itself presents complications that scholars have long debated. Some genealogical calculations suggest Nakshidil may have entered the Ottoman court earlier than Aimé's documented 1788 disappearance would allow, which, if accurate, would make a direct connection between the two women chronologically difficult, if not impossible. And yet, the legend has persisted for more than 2 centuries, repeated across numerous popular histories, biographies, and even diplomatic anecdotes exchanged between French and Ottoman officials in later years, some of whom appear to have genuinely believed the connection themselves. Why has a story with such shaky documentary foundation proven so durable? Perhaps because the alternative, that a colonial planter's daughter simply drowned in an unremarkable, undocumented shipwreck, one of thousands lost to the Atlantic during this period, offers no story at all, only silence. The Nakshidil legend, whether true or not, gave a name and a continued existence to a girl who otherwise vanished from history without explanation, a resolution the historical record itself was never able to provide. Some historians have proposed a middle position, that Aimée may indeed have been captured by corsairs and entered a harem somewhere in North Africa or the Ottoman world, but not necessarily as Nakshidil Sultan specifically, her true fate simply absorbed into a much larger and better documented figure's story over generations of retelling, as families and later writers sought to explain an unresolved disappearance by attaching it to the nearest plausible legend. What remains certain is this: a young woman from Martinique left for France in 1788 and never arrived. What happened to her in the years that followed exists today only as a set of competing narratives, none conclusively proven, none entirely disproven, sustained by genealogical claims, court gossip passed between diplomats, and a genuine, well-documented history of corsair activity that makes the underlying premise, however impossible to confirm, at least plausible. Did Aimée Dubuc de Rivéry perish quietly in the Atlantic, one of countless unrecorded losses at sea during an era that rarely mourned such disappearances publicly? Or did she truly survive capture, transformation, and relocation halfway across the world, eventually shaping the future of an empire under a name her own family in Martinique would never have recognized? 2 centuries later, no definitive record has closed the distance between these possibilities. Only a name, a legend, and a ship that sailed into history and never sailed back out of it. A door bolted from the inside, the creak of floorboards in an empty house, and beneath it all, the distant, constant sound of the London docks. Ropes creaking, gulls crying, ships arriving from every corner of the known world, carrying with them sailors, strangers, and men whose names would never make it into any manifest. Ratcliff Highway, in December of 1811, was a narrow, densely packed thoroughfare running through the East End of London, near the bustling docks of Wapping. It was a rough, transient neighborhood, home to sailors between voyages, shopkeepers, laborers, and a constant churn of newcomers arriving by ship, making it, by its very nature, one of the more difficult places in London to keep track of exactly who belonged and who did not. On the night of December 7, 1811, a hosier named Timothy Marr, his wife Celia, their infant son, and a young shop apprentice were brutally murdered inside their home and shop on the highway. The killer, or killers, entered with apparent ease and left behind a scene of extreme violence. The weapons used, a ship carpenter's mallet known as a maul, and a long sharpened chisel, discovered at the scene, both items commonly associated with maritime trades, given the neighborhood's overwhelming population of sailors and dock workers. Only 12 days later, on December 19th, a second, nearly identical attack occurred at the King's Arms Tavern, less than a quarter-mile away. The tavern keeper, John Williamson, his wife, and their servant were murdered in a similarly brutal fashion. A lodger staying at the tavern survived by climbing out of an upstairs window and raising the alarm, an account that provided investigators with their only direct, if brief and panicked, description of what had unfolded inside. The verified facts of the case, preserved in surviving court records, contemporary newspaper accounts, and the writings of essayist Thomas de Quincey, who later became fascinated with the murders, describe a city gripped by genuine, widespread terror. London, in 1811, had no organized police force in the modern sense. Law enforcement relied on a patchwork of parish constables and privately funded watchmen, poorly equipped to investigate crimes of this speed and brutality. Vigilante groups reportedly began forming in the neighborhood, armed and patrolling the streets themselves, while newspapers openly criticized the authorities' inability to identify a suspect in either attack. An arrest was eventually made. A sailor named John Williams, who had reportedly been lodging at a local pub and was known to have been in the vicinity of both crime scenes, was taken into custody based largely on circumstantial evidence, including reported financial troubles, unexplained absences on the nights in question, and testimony suggesting he had recently pawned or acquired items inconsistent with his known income. Before Williams could stand trial, he was found dead in his cell, having apparently hanged himself. This is where the case, rather than closing, begins to widen into genuine uncertainty. Authorities, under intense public pressure to resolve the matter, declared the case solved, treating Williams' death as a tacit admission of guilt. His body was subjected to a public procession through the streets of Wapping, a traditional punishment for suspected murderers of the era, before being buried at a crossroads with a stake driven through his body, in keeping with older folk customs meant to prevent the dead from returning. But was the case actually solved? No confession from Williams survives, if one was ever given at all. No definitive physical evidence, by modern forensic standards, directly linked him to either crime scene beyond circumstantial association and geographic proximity. Some contemporaries voiced quiet skepticism even at the time, noting how conveniently the case had resolved itself once a body was no longer available to testify in its own defense, and how thoroughly public panic and demand for resolution may have shaped the investigation's conclusions. Thomas de Quincey, writing decades later in his essay On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts, treated the Ratcliff highway case less as settled history than as an object of ongoing fascination, describing the murders with a level of narrative and psychological detail that suggests even educated observers of the period were not entirely convinced the full truth had been uncovered, or ever would be. The more speculative theories that emerged in the years following point to alternative suspects, including other sailors known to have been in the area, and even suggestions of a second, uncaught killer who may have used the panic surrounding Williams' arrest and death as cover. Some later researchers have questioned whether a single individual could plausibly have carried out both attacks with the speed, precision, and apparent physical strength documented at each scene, raising the possibility, never conclusively proven or disproven, that more than one person was involved in one or both nights of violence. The murders did produce one lasting, verifiable legacy. Public outrage over the inadequacy of London's law enforcement response directly contributed to reforms that would, over the following decades, eventually lead to the establishment of London's modern police force. What remains unresolved is narrower, but no less unsettling. Did John Williams truly commit both attacks alone, taking whatever remaining truth he possessed with him into an unmarked crossroads grave? Or did London, in its desperate need for resolution and its understandable terror, settle for the nearest available answer rather than the correct one? More than 2 centuries later, the docks along the Thames still hum with the same restless traffic they carried that December, indifferent, as they always have been, to whichever version of the truth actually walked among them that winter. A stake, driven into the earth at a crossroads, meant to keep something buried and forgotten. 16 years later, in the quiet farmland of Suffolk, England, another burial would be made in secret, not marked by folk ritual meant to contain a threat, but hidden precisely to ensure no one would ever come looking at all. The village of Polstead, in the English county of Suffolk, was a peaceful farming community in the 1820s, its fields and cottages arranged around a parish church, its rhythms governed by the seasons rather than by scandal. On the edge of one such field stood a modest agricultural building, known locally as the Red Barn, named for the reddish hue its roof took on in certain light. It was an unremarkable structure, used for storing grain and equipment, until May of 1827, when it became the site of one of the most sensationalized crimes in early 19th century England. Maria Marten was, by the verified historical record, a young woman in her mid-20s, the daughter of a local mole catcher, who had already borne children out of wedlock to more than one man in the years before her death. A circumstance that placed her in a socially precarious position by the standards of the era. Her relationship with William Corder, the son of a locally prominent farming family, produced a child who died in infancy, and by early 1827, the two had reportedly agreed on a plan. Maria would disguise herself in men's clothing, and Corder would meet her at the Red Barn, from which the couple would travel together to Ipswich to be married, in order to avoid local gossip surrounding their relationship and her past. She was never seen alive again. In the weeks and months that followed, William Corder wrote to Maria's family, claiming she was safe, living comfortably with him on the Isle of Wight, offering various explanations for why she could not yet return to visit or correspond with them directly. For nearly a year, this explanation, however thin, appears to have been largely accepted, or at least not seriously challenged, by a family who had limited means and limited standing to investigate further on their own. What broke the case, according to the most widely repeated historical account, was a dream. Maria's stepmother, Anne Marten, reportedly experienced a series of vivid dreams in which she saw Maria's body buried beneath the floor of the Red Barn. Whether out of genuine belief in the dream's significance, or perhaps existing suspicion given voice through it, she convinced Maria's father to search the barn directly. Beneath its floor, they discovered the body of a young woman, badly decomposed, later identified through clothing and dental features as Maria Marten. William Corder was tracked down, arrested, and returned to Suffolk to stand trial, which drew enormous public attention and extensive newspaper coverage, transforming the case into one of the defining criminal sensations of the era. He initially denied involvement, then offered shifting accounts of Maria's death, at various points suggesting she had died by her own hand, or during an accidental struggle, before the physical evidence in prosecution's case ultimately led to his conviction for murder. He was executed by public hanging in August of 1828, before a crowd reported to number in the tens of thousands. On its surface, this reads as a tragically clear case. A manipulative man, a vulnerable young woman, a secret burial, and eventual justice delivered through both fortunate discovery and formal prosecution. And for most historians, this mainstream account, however dramatic in its details, remains the accepted version of events. But does the story's neat resolution fully account for the stranger elements that surrounded it from the very beginning? The dream itself remains one of history's more genuinely puzzling footnotes. Was Anne Marten's account of repeated specific visions simply a dramatic embellishment, added or emphasized after the fact to heighten a story already primed for sensation, once the body's location was independently suspected or discovered through other, more mundane means? Or does it represent a genuine, if inexplicable, instance of intuition, anxiety, or grief manifesting with uncanny specificity, a psychological phenomenon modern researchers might explain differently than the superstitious language of the period allowed? Beyond the dream, questions have also lingered around the trial itself, and whether public fascination with the case, fueled by an emerging popular press eager for lurid detail, shaped the proceedings, and the swift certainty of the verdict more than the available evidence alone might have justified in a less publicized case. Some later writers have questioned whether Corder acted entirely alone, or whether Maria's own precarious social position and the desperation it created played a role in events that a simple narrative of villain and victim does not fully capture. The Red Barn itself became something of a dark attraction in the years following the trial, gradually stripped of pieces by souvenir hunters until almost nothing of the original structure remained, eventually destroyed entirely by fire decades later, as if the physical evidence of the case, like so much else surrounding it, was destined to erode into legend rather than remain available for closer examination. Was Maria Marten's death a straightforward, if brutal, act of a man protecting his reputation from a socially inconvenient relationship? Or does the peculiar mixture of prophetic dreams, shifting confessions, and a public trial shaped as much by sensation as by evidence suggest a story still not fully told, its remaining details as decomposed and inaccessible now as the barn floor that once concealed them? 2 centuries later, the field in Polstead remains quiet, the barn long gone, and the dream that first pointed toward the truth no more explainable today than it was in 1827. We have already met him once, a clockmaker named Carl Wilhelm Noendorf, who arrived in Paris in 1833 insisting he was the boy who died, or perhaps did not die, in the Temple prison decades earlier. His claim was only one thread in a story far larger and stranger than a single man's testimony. To understand the full weight of what happened after Louis Charles' recorded death, we must step back and look at the entire strange procession of men who spent their lives insisting they were France's lost king. Versailles and the ruined splendor of the French monarchy it once represented cast a long shadow over Europe in the decades following the Revolution. The guillotine had fallen. The old order had been dismantled, rebuilt, and dismantled again through Napoleon's rise and fall. And yet, threading through all of this political upheaval, a peculiar phenomenon persisted: the conviction, held by ordinary people across multiple countries, that the boy king declared dead in 1795 might still be alive somewhere, waiting to reclaim what had been taken from him. The verified historical facts establish the foundation clearly enough. Louis Charles, formerly titled Louis XVII by royalist supporters despite never actually reigning, was officially recorded as having died in the Temple prison in June of 1795. His death attributed to tuberculosis following 2 years of isolation and documented neglect. No public funeral was held. He was buried quickly and somewhat obscurely in a common grave near the Church of Sainte Marguerite in Paris, a burial so lacking in ceremony or careful documentation that later efforts to definitively locate his remains proved difficult for generations of investigators. This absence of a clear, verifiable burial site, combined with the secretive and often contradictory conditions of his final 2 years of captivity, created fertile ground for doubt. And doubt, once planted in a political climate as unstable as post-revolutionary France, tended to grow quickly. Over the following decades, more than 100 individuals across Europe and North America came forward at various points claiming to be the surviving Dauphin. Most were dismissed quickly, their stories thin, their knowledge of royal life inconsistent with what was actually known about the family. But several claimants managed to build substantial, lasting followings, and their stories, taken together, illustrate just how deeply the uncertainty surrounding Louis Charles' fate embedded itself into the broader culture of the period. Noendorf remains the most historically significant of these claimants, having arrived with detailed, specific knowledge of the royal family's private habits and history. Knowledge that convinced a number of people who had genuinely known Louis Charles in his childhood, including, according to several contemporary accounts, members of his own former household staff. Noendorf pursued formal legal recognition for years, and his case grew serious enough that French authorities eventually exiled him from the country entirely, a response some supporters interpreted less as proof of fraud than as evidence that his claim had grown too credible and too politically inconvenient to allow him to remain. Other claimants took different paths entirely. A man calling himself Eleazar Williams surfaced in the United States, living among the Native American Oneida community in New York State, claiming that he had been secretly transported across the Atlantic as a child and raised in obscurity to protect his identity from those who wished him dead. His story gained enough public attention in the mid-19th century to draw the interest of American newspapers, though it was never substantiated through documentary evidence connecting him credibly to the French royal household. Still others, with names now largely forgotten outside specialist historical circles, surfaced across Germany, Prussia, and various corners of the fracturing post-Napoleonic European order, each carrying some version of the same essential narrative. A childhood in hiding, fragmented memories of royal life, and a conviction that circumstances, once explained, would restore what revolution had stolen. Why did this particular phenomenon reach such an extraordinary scale when comparable historical disappearances rarely produced such sustained and widespread imitation? Some historians point to the sheer symbolic weight of the French monarchy's collapse, a rupture so profound that it left an entire generation searching for some sign that continuity, however improbable, might still exist beneath the wreckage. Others suggest more practical explanations, noting that a surviving Dauphin represented genuine political and financial opportunity for anyone convincing enough to sustain the claim, particularly during the several restoration periods when French royal legitimacy remained an open and actively contested question. The DNA testing conducted in the year 2000 on the preserved heart, removed during the original 1795 autopsy, and eventually returned to the royal crypt at Saint-Denis, has since offered what many historians consider the closest available answer. Its genetic markers reported as consistent with maternal descent from Marie Antoinette's family line. For most serious scholars, this evidence settles the central question. The boy who died in the temple was almost certainly Louis Charles himself, and every claimant who followed, however sincere or convincing, was ultimately mistaken. And yet, does a single physical sample, tested 2 centuries after the fact, fully explain why so many separate individuals, across such different countries and circumstances, arrived independently at strikingly similar claims? Was this simply the natural human tendency to imagine survival in the place of a painful, unresolved death, repeated so many times it eventually resembled a pattern? Or does the sheer persistence of these claims suggest something about those final, poorly documented years in the temple, that historical record-keeping, however extensive, never fully captured? More than 2 centuries later, the heart rests quietly in its crypt. The claimants are long buried themselves, their descendants scattered across continents that still, in some cases, carry disputed royal surnames. What remains is a question that DNA evidence has narrowed, but perhaps never entirely closed. Why did an entire era need to believe, so badly and so often, that the boy in the tower had somehow, somewhere, survived? From the fractured, post-revolutionary landscape of France, we travel now north, across the Baltic, to a kingdom watching those same revolutionary tremors with a mixture of fascination and dread. A masked ball, held inside one of Europe's grandest opera houses, in the Kingdom of Sweden. The Royal Swedish Opera House in Stockholm was, in 1792, a relatively new architectural jewel, built at the personal direction of King Gustav III himself, a monarch who saw the arts not merely as entertainment, but as an essential instrument of royal prestige and political messaging. On the night of March 16, 1792, the Opera House hosted a lavish masquerade ball, its guests concealed behind elaborate masks and costumes, precisely the kind of anonymized theatrical gathering the king himself had long favored, and precisely the kind of setting that would ultimately make him vulnerable. Gustav III had ruled Sweden since 1771, having seized near absolute power through a bloodless coup early in his reign, sidelining the aristocratic council that had previously constrained the Swedish monarchy. His rule was, by the verified historical record, deeply polarizing. He was praised by supporters as a genuine reformer, someone who modernized aspects of Swedish law, promoted the arts, and pursued an ambitious, if costly, foreign policy. He was equally reviled by segments of the Swedish nobility, who resented both the loss of their traditional political influence and the financial strain of his military campaigns, particularly an expensive and largely unsuccessful war against Russia in the years just prior to his death. By early 1792, a conspiracy had formed among a group of disaffected noblemen, determined to remove Gustav from power, whether through forced abdication or, if necessary, more permanent means. The verified facts here are unusually well documented, since several conspirators were later captured, interrogated, and put on trial, leaving behind a substantial paper record rare for assassination plots of this era. At the masquerade ball, a nobleman named Jacob Johann Ankarström approached the king from behind amid the crowd of costumed guests and shot him at close range with a pistol concealed for the occasion. Gustav, wounded but still conscious, was carried from the opera house, and initially, in the confusion of the massive costumed crowd, no one could say with certainty who had fired the shot, since dozens of masked guests matched no clear description at all. The king lingered for nearly 2 weeks before ultimately succumbing to his wound and dying on March 29, 1792. In that time, Swedish authorities conducted an intense investigation, ultimately identifying Ankarström as the shooter and uncovering a broader conspiracy involving several additional noblemen who had reportedly discussed, planned, and financially supported the assassination attempt in the months leading up to that March evening. On its surface, this presents itself as one of history's more thoroughly documented and clearly resolved political assassinations. A resented, autocratic monarch, a documented conspiracy among aggrieved nobles, a named shooter captured and executed, additional conspirators identified and punished through formal legal proceedings. The mainstream historical account treats the case correctly as a conspiracy that was substantially uncovered and prosecuted, unlike so many of the mysteries that have come before it in this exploration. And yet, does the neatness of the official narrative fully account for the questions that lingered in its margins? Ankarström, under interrogation, insisted for a period of time that he had acted entirely alone, seemingly attempting to protect his co-conspirators from the full consequences of their involvement, even as physical and testimonial evidence increasingly implicated others. This raises a quieter question historians have continued to debate. How many individuals within the broader Swedish nobility were aware of the plot in advance and simply chose silence over warning, either out of shared resentment toward the king or fear of being implicated themselves? The formal trials identified a defined circle of active conspirators, but rumors persisted for years afterward that the true scope of foreknowledge extended considerably further into the Swedish aristocracy than the official proceedings ever fully acknowledged or prosecuted. There is also the matter of foreign involvement, a thread historians have never entirely dismissed nor fully substantiated. Sweden's costly and unpopular war against Russia had strained the kingdom's finances and its political stability considerably, and some scholars have questioned whether foreign powers, particularly Russia, may have had knowledge of, or even indirect influence over, growing domestic opposition to Gustav's rule, given how directly his removal served broader Russian interests in the region. No definitive documentary evidence has ever surfaced connecting Russian agents directly to the assassination plot itself, and most historians regard this as speculative at best, though the timing and political convenience of Gustav's death, arriving amid such a fraught foreign policy landscape, has never entirely escaped scrutiny. Ankarström himself was publicly flogged over several days before his eventual execution, a punishment severe even by the standards of the period, which some contemporaries interpreted as reflecting not just legal punishment, but a demonstrative message intended to discourage any further conspiracies from those who may have shared his sympathies but avoided direct implication. Gustav III's death is often remembered, particularly through later dramatization, including Verdi's opera loosely based on the events, as a clean, almost theatrical tragedy. A king shot at a masquerade, fittingly unable to see the face of the man who ended his reign. But how much of the full conspiracy died alongside Ankarström at his execution? How many names within Sweden's aristocracy, quietly aware of the plot in advance, were never brought before any court at all? More than 2 centuries later, the Opera House still stands in Stockholm, its records more thorough than most cases in this exploration, and its silences, however narrower than usual, no less real for being so carefully documented. 25 years after a masked king fell in a Stockholm opera house, another royal death would grip an entire nation in mourning. This time, not from an assassin's bullet, but from complications that, on their surface, seem to belong to the most ordinary and universal of human experiences: childbirth. Claremont House, a stately country estate in Surrey, England, was in November of 1817 the residence of Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate child of the Prince Regent, later King George IV, and heir presumptive to the British throne. She was 21 years old, recently married to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, and heavily pregnant with a child whose birth the entire nation had been anticipating for months, a birth expected to secure the Hanoverian succession for another generation. The verified historical facts describe a labor that began on November 3rd and stretched on with agonizing slowness for more than 50 hours. Charlotte's primary physician, Sir Richard Croft, adhered to the prevailing medical philosophy of the era, one that favored minimal intervention, avoiding forceps or other assisted delivery methods except as an absolute last resort, believing the body, given sufficient time, would ultimately resolve the birth on its own. Charlotte, according to contemporaneous accounts, was kept on a notably restrictive diet in the weeks leading up to labor, a common practice at the time intended to keep the baby smaller and the delivery easier, though modern medical historians have since questioned whether this practice, rather than easing her labor, may have left her dangerously weakened for the ordeal ahead. After more than 2 days of labor, Charlotte delivered a stillborn son, a large infant whose difficult positioning is now understood by modern obstetric historians as a probable contributing factor to the prolonged and traumatic delivery. For several hours afterward, Charlotte appeared to be recovering, speaking with her attendants, expressing grief over her son's death, but showing no immediate signs of the crisis to come. Then, in the early hours of November 6th, she began suffering severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and difficulty breathing. Within hours, Princess Charlotte was dead, most likely from postpartum hemorrhage, a catastrophic and, at the time, largely unpreventable complication that claimed the lives of many women of every social class during this era, regardless of the quality of care available to them. The nation's grief was reportedly immense and immediate, comparable in scale, by several contemporary accounts, to reactions that would later follow other unexpected royal deaths in British history. Shops closed. Public mourning stretched across weeks. And almost as quickly as the grief spread, so too did questions about whether Charlotte's death, and that of her son, might have been prevented. The mainstream historical explanation, supported by modern medical analysis of the surviving case notes, holds that Charlotte's death resulted from a combination of factors common to the obstetric practices of the period: an overly cautious approach to a prolonged and complicated labor, a restrictive prenatal diet that may have weakened her physically, and a subsequent hemorrhage that period medicine had no reliable means of treating, regardless of how promptly it was identified. Under this reading, Charlotte's death was a tragedy of medical limitation rather than negligence or intention, a fate that, statistically, befell women across England with grim regularity during this period, elevated to national significance only because of who she happened to be. But does this explanation fully address the intense public and professional scrutiny that fell upon Sir Richard Croft in the months following her death? Croft faced immediate and severe criticism, both from fellow physicians who questioned his conservative approach to the delivery and from a public desperate to assign blame for a loss that felt, to many, entirely avoidable. Some contemporaries specifically argued that earlier intervention, particularly the use of forceps once labor had clearly stalled for an extended period, might have prevented both the stillbirth and the hemorrhage that followed. Croft, by most accounts increasingly consumed by guilt and the weight of public condemnation, took his own life several months later, in February of 1818, while attending another difficult birth, a death that many at the time interpreted as a tacit admission that he believed the criticism against him to be justified. Beyond questions of medical practice, more speculative theories emerged in the years following Charlotte's death, some pointing toward the notoriously complex and often hostile relationships within the British royal family itself. Charlotte's relationship with her own father had long been strained, and her position as heir presumptive placed her at the center of ongoing political tension regarding the succession, tension that some later writers have suggested, without ever producing credible supporting evidence, may have created motive for deliberate medical negligence, or worse, though mainstream historians have consistently found no credible basis for such claims beyond the genuine medical limitations of the era. What cannot be disputed is the scale of the consequences that followed. Charlotte's death, and the death of her infant son, triggered what became known as the succession crisis of 1817, prompting several of her unmarried royal uncles to hastily seek wives and produce heirs of their own, a scramble that would eventually, indirectly, lead to the birth of a girl who would grow up to become Queen Victoria, reshaping the entire trajectory of the British monarchy for the remainder of the century. Was Princess Charlotte's death simply an unavoidable tragedy of an era before modern obstetric medicine existed to prevent it? One royal family's private grief magnified by public significance? Or did decisions made in that Claremont House birthing room, whether through caution, error, or something else entirely, alter the succession of an empire in ways history has never fully reckoned with? More than 2 centuries later, Croft's own guilt-driven death remains the closest thing to a verdict the case ever received. A verdict delivered not by any court, but by the private conscience of a man who never publicly explained what, if anything, he believed he had done wrong. From the quiet birthing room of an English country estate, we travel now to the opposite side of the world entirely. Across oceans Charlotte would never have imagined crossing, to a black sand bay in the Hawaiian Islands where, decades earlier, another Englishman's story had ended in violence, and where the paper trail meant to explain his final days remains, even now, incomplete. Kealakekua Bay, on the western coast of the island of Hawaii, is a striking natural harbor, framed by dramatic volcanic cliffs and clear blue water, a place regarded by native Hawaiians as sacred ground even before the arrival of European ships. It was here, in February of 1779, that Captain James Cook, already one of the most celebrated navigators in British history, met his death during a violent confrontation on the shore, and it is here that a separate, quieter mystery began, one involving not his body, but his papers. Cook's third and final Pacific voyage had, by early 1779, already produced an extraordinary volume of documentation, detailed charts, astronomical observations, botanical records, and personal journals chronicling years of exploration across the Pacific. This written record was, in a very real sense, the primary purpose of the voyage itself, commissioned by the Royal Society and the British Admiralty to expand European scientific and geographic understanding of a region still largely unmapped by Western cartography. The verified historical facts surrounding Cook's death itself are relatively well established. After an initially peaceful and even celebratory reception by native Hawaiians, tensions escalated following the theft of a small boat from Cook's ship, prompting Cook to attempt taking a local chief hostage as leverage for its return, a tactic he had used with some success in earlier encounters elsewhere in the Pacific. This attempt provoked a violent confrontation on the beach, during which Cook was killed, along with several of his Marines. What happened next, regarding his body and his extensive written records, is where the historical picture becomes considerably murkier. Cook's remains were reportedly treated according to Hawaiian customs typically reserved for high-status individuals, a process that involved the separation and preservation of certain body parts, a detail that shocked and disturbed his surviving crew when portions of his remains were eventually returned to the ships days later for burial at sea. This much, disturbing as it may be, is reasonably well documented. His papers present a more complicated picture. Cook's official journals, along with a significant portion of his charts and scientific notes, were indeed recovered and eventually made their way back to England, where they formed the basis of the officially published account of the voyage. But historians examining the full documentary record have long noted inconsistencies and gaps, sections of certain logs that appear incomplete, references in crew members' personal accounts to observations, conversations, and events that do not appear anywhere in the officially surviving record, and a small but persistent number of documents referenced in contemporary correspondence that have never been definitively located in any archive. Why would portions of one of the most historically significant expeditions in British naval history remain incomplete or unaccounted for? The mainstream explanation offered by most historians is admittedly unglamorous. The sheer chaos surrounding Cook's death, the loss of at least one associated vessel and its contents during the broader voyage, and the ordinary, unremarkable process of documents being damaged, misplaced, or simply not prioritized for preservation during a long and difficult sea voyage home, likely accounts for most of the gaps that modern researchers have identified. Naval expeditions of this era, however historically significant in hindsight, were not always meticulously archived by the standards later generations would come to expect. But does this explanation fully satisfy the more specific and persistent claims that have circulated since the 19th century, particularly rumors that certain officers aboard Cook's ships deliberately altered, suppressed, or destroyed portions of the official record, either to protect their own reputations regarding decisions made in the final, chaotic days before Cook's death, or to control the broader narrative of what had actually transpired at Kealakekwa Bay? Some historians have pointed to specific inconsistencies between officers' private letters and journals and the officially sanctioned published account, suggesting that the version of events prepared for public and Admiralty consumption was, at minimum, carefully curated to present Cook's final decisions and those of his subordinates in a more favorable light than some surviving private testimony might otherwise support. Whether this constitutes a deliberate cover-up or simply the ordinary, self-protective editorial instincts of officers navigating the political and professional consequences of their commanding officer's death, remains a matter of genuine historical debate rather than settled fact. More speculative theories, circulating largely in the 2 centuries since, have suggested that certain missing documents may have contained more extensive and candid records of tensions between Cook's crew and native Hawaiians in the days immediately preceding his death. Records that, if fully public, might have painted a considerably less flattering portrait of the expedition's own conduct than the version of events that ultimately reached British audiences. No confirmed missing document has ever surfaced to substantiate this claim directly, and it remains, by the standards of rigorous historical scholarship, an open question rather than an established conclusion. What survives today, held across various British archives, includes an extraordinary and genuinely invaluable record of one of history's great voyages of exploration, alongside persistent, unresolved gaps that continue to draw the attention of historians specializing in this period. Were these gaps simply the unavoidable casualties of a chaotic death and a long journey home? Or does some portion of the true, unfiltered account of those final days at Kealakekwa Bay remain deliberately absent from the historical record, tucked away in some private collection, or lost entirely to time and the same ocean that carried Cook to that shore in the first place? More than 2 centuries later, the bay remains a place of quiet reflection and unresolved memory, its waters holding whatever final truths were never committed to paper at all. The scrape of a razor drawn across a throat behind a locked door. A single, choked cry. Then silence, broken only by the arrival of servants who had been expressly, urgently forbidden to leave their master alone. Cray Farm, a country estate in Kent, England, was, in August of 1822, the private retreat of one of the most powerful and controversial statesmen in British history. Robert Stewart, Lord Londonderry, better known to history by his earlier title, Viscount Castlereagh, had served for years as Britain's Foreign Secretary, playing a central role in the diplomatic negotiations that reshaped Europe following Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. He was, by any measure, one of the most consequential political figures of his generation, and by the summer of 1822, according to nearly every account from those closest to him, a man visibly, alarmingly unraveling. The verified historical facts describe a rapid and deeply concerning decline in Castlereagh's mental state during the weeks preceding his death. Colleagues, family members, and even King George IV himself, who met with him shortly before his death, reported that Castlereagh appeared paranoid, exhausted, and increasingly convinced that unnamed enemies were plotting against him, accusing him of crimes he insisted he had not committed. Some accounts suggest he believed himself the target of a blackmail scheme, though the precise nature of what he feared being exposed for was never entirely clarified by those who spoke with him in his final days, and has remained a subject of historical speculation ever since. Alarmed by his condition, his wife and physicians removed sharp objects, including razors, from his immediate reach, and arranged for close continuous supervision, a precaution that reflected genuine fear for his safety rather than mere concern for his comfort. On the morning of August 12, 1822, however, Castlereagh managed to obtain a small penknife that had been overlooked during these precautions, and in a locked dressing room at Cray Farm, took his own life by cutting his throat, dying within moments before help could reach him. The mainstream historical explanation, supported by the extensive documented decline in his mental health in the weeks and months preceding his death, holds that Castlereagh's suicide resulted from a severe psychological breakdown, likely brought on by the immense and sustained pressures of his political career, compounded by exhaustion following years of demanding diplomatic work across a Europe still settling into its uneasy post-Napoleonic order. This reading finds considerable support in the numerous, independent, and strikingly consistent accounts of his final weeks, offered not by hostile political rivals, with reason to exaggerate his instability, but by close friends, family, and even the king, none of whom appeared to have any particular motive to fabricate the severity of his condition. And yet, does this explanation fully address the persistent and politically charged rumors that circulated both before and after his death? Rumors that suggested Castlereagh's paranoia may not have been entirely without foundation. Castlereagh had, over the course of his long political career, accumulated no shortage of genuine enemies. His role in suppressing the Irish Rebellion of 1798 and later orchestrating the Act of Union between Ireland and Great Britain had earned him lasting bitter resentment among Irish nationalists. His domestic policies, including support for restrictive measures following the Peterloo Massacre of 1819, made him deeply unpopular among British reformers and the working class, to the point that his death was met in certain quarters with open public celebration rather than mourning, an unusually harsh reaction for a sitting government minister. Some later historians have questioned whether the specific blackmail fears Castlereagh expressed in his final weeks, however irrational they may have appeared to those around him, might have been rooted in some genuine, if exaggerated, personal or political vulnerability, one that has never been fully documented or explained. More speculative theories, circulating largely among fringe historical interpretations rather than mainstream scholarship, have suggested that Castlereagh's death may have been influenced, precipitated, or even orchestrated by political enemies who recognized his deteriorating mental state as an opportunity, whether through deliberate psychological manipulation or more direct interference, though no credible evidence has ever substantiated these claims beyond the documented, independently corroborated pattern of genuine psychological collapse observed by multiple credible witnesses in his final weeks. What remains undisputed is the manner of his death, and the immediate visceral shock it produced across a political establishment that had, for better or worse, relied on his steady presence in shaping Britain's role on the world stage for over a decade. His funeral procession to Westminster Abbey was met with a jarring mixture of solemn state ceremony and open jeering from crowds who had never forgiven him for Peterloo, a stark illustration of just how divided public sentiment toward him remained, even in death. Was Lord Londonderry's death simply the tragic culmination of a brilliant, overburdened mind finally giving way under the accumulated weight of years spent shaping a continent's fragile peace? Or did the specific fears that consumed his final weeks point toward some genuine, unresolved vulnerability, some political or personal secret that historians, working only from the accounts of those who witnessed his unraveling rather than whatever knowledge he alone possessed, have never been able to fully reconstruct? 2 centuries later, the penknife that ended his life has long since vanished from the historical record, and the precise nature of what haunted Castlereagh in his final days remains, like so much else in this exploration, known only to the man who never lived to explain it. It is worth pausing for a moment on how often this exploration has returned to a single, recurring image: a body without a marked grave, a family denied the simple certainty of knowing where their dead truly rest. We saw it with Louis XVII. We saw it with the Claimants who spent their lives insisting the boy in the tower had survived. That same unresolved absence, it turns out, extends far beyond one prince, into the fate of an entire royal house, scattered, executed, and in several cases, lost entirely to the historical record. The Basilica of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, has served for centuries as the traditional burial site of French royalty, its crypts holding the remains of kings and queens stretching back through generations of the Bourbon dynasty. During the height of the French Revolution, however, this sacred continuity was violently interrupted. In 1793, revolutionary authorities ordered the royal tombs at Saint-Denis opened and desecrated, the remains of centuries of French monarchs removed, and, in many documented cases, dumped unceremoniously into mass graves nearby, a deliberate act intended to symbolically and physically erase the monarchy's claim to sacred, uninterrupted legitimacy. This act of desecration, disturbing enough on its own, becomes considerably more complicated when we consider the members of the royal family who died during the revolution itself. whose remains, unlike their ancestors already interred at Saint-Denis, were never given even the basic formal burial customary for the era. The verified historical facts establish a grim, well-documented pattern. Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in January of 1793, his remains reportedly buried in a mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, treated with lime to accelerate decomposition, a common practice for revolutionary executions intended to prevent any lingering sight of royalist pilgrimage or reverence. Marie Antoinette followed him to the same fate later that year, her remains subjected to similar treatment. Louis Charles, as we have already explored, died in the Temple prison in 1795, his body buried quickly and with minimal documentation near the Church of Sainte Marguerite. Madame Elisabeth, the king's sister, was executed in 1794, her remains reportedly interred in yet another mass grave, whose exact boundaries were never precisely recorded at the time. When the monarchy was eventually restored under Louis XVI in 1815, one of the new king's earliest priorities involved attempting to locate and formally reinter the remains of his executed family members at Saint-Denis, restoring both the physical remains and the symbolic continuity the revolution had so deliberately shattered. This effort, however, ran directly into a problem that has never been fully resolved. The mass graves used during the revolution had, in several cases, received multiple bodies over extended periods, with minimal or entirely absent documentation distinguishing one set of remains from another. For Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, officials working from contemporary witness accounts, clothing fragments, and the relatively limited number of burials at the specific site associated with their execution felt reasonably confident in their identification, and their remains were formally reinterred at Saint-Denis in 1815, where they rest today. But does reasonable confidence, established more than 2 decades after the original burial, in a grave whose precise boundaries and contents were never carefully documented at the time, constitute the same thing as certainty? For several other Bourbon family members who died during the Revolution, the situation proved considerably less resolvable. Madame Elisabeth's exact burial location was never definitively identified, despite genuine and sustained efforts by royalist investigators in the years following the Restoration. Attempts to locate additional royal remains from various mass graves used throughout the Revolutionary period produced inconsistent, sometimes contradictory results, as investigators worked from decades-old, often unreliable witness testimony in graves that had, in the intervening years, been built over, repurposed, or otherwise disturbed by the ordinary expansion of the city around them. This uncertainty has, over the following 2 centuries, opened space for a range of speculation, most of it far more restrained than the dramatic claimant stories surrounding Louis Charles specifically, but no less genuinely unresolved. Some historians have raised the quiet possibility that remains reinterred at Saint-Denis under specific royal names may not, in every single case, definitively belong to the individuals officially credited, given the documented chaos and inconsistent record-keeping surrounding mass revolutionary burials. Modern forensic and genetic testing, of the kind eventually applied to Louis Charles' preserved heart, has in some cases been used to lend additional confidence to certain identifications, though not every set of remains associated with this period has been subjected to equivalent scientific scrutiny, leaving some questions still resting primarily on documentary and circumstantial evidence rather than direct physical confirmation. Why does this particular uncertainty matter, beyond the purely academic? For royalist families and historians alike, the question of whose remains truly rest at Saint-Denis touches directly on matters of legitimacy, memory, and the physical tangible continuity of a dynasty that the Revolution had worked so deliberately to erase. A grave, correctly identified, offers closure. A grave whose true occupant remains uncertain offers something closer to an open wound, disguised, for 2 centuries now, beneath the solemn architecture of formal royal burial. What remains, in the end, is a basilica holding the presumed remains of a family whose final years were defined by violence, secrecy, and revolutionary chaos so thorough that even the most basic act of properly burying the dead became, for several of its members, an impossibility that later generations could only partially, imperfectly correct. Do all of the Bourbon remains resting today at Saint-Denis truly belong to the individuals whose names mark their tombs? Or does some quiet portion of that revolutionary uncertainty remain buried alongside them, undisturbed by the 2 centuries of careful, well-intentioned effort that followed? The crypt keeps its silence, as crypts generally do, and the historical record, for all its documented detail, has never quite managed to fill every gap that revolution and time have left behind. A full century before Bourbon bones were scattered into unmarked revolutionary graves, another prisoner connected to that same royal house had already vanished into a different kind of anonymity, not through violence or chaos, but through a deliberate, sustained, and remarkably effective campaign of state-enforced secrecy that would outlive the man himself by centuries. The Bastille, that formidable fortress prison in the heart of Paris, held countless prisoners across its long history, most of them forgotten by all but their own families. But one prisoner, transferred there in 1698 after years of confinement in various other French fortresses, has never been forgotten, precisely because no one, then or now, has ever definitively established who he actually was. He is known to history only by the mask he was reportedly required to wear whenever he appeared in public or in the presence of anyone outside his most immediate and trusted guards, the man in the iron mask, though contemporary records suggest the mask itself was more likely made of black velvet rather than iron, a detail later embellished considerably by popular fiction. The verified historical facts surrounding this prisoner are, by design, remarkably sparse. Prison records confirm he was held under the direct personal authority of Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a jailer entrusted across multiple postings with several of France's most sensitive and secretive prisoners, suggesting the masked man's identity was considered a matter of genuine state importance rather than ordinary criminal confinement. He was treated, by several accounts, with unusual deference for a prisoner, provided with fine linens, good food, and other comforts inconsistent with typical imprisonment of the era, even as his true identity was concealed with extraordinary, sustained effort. He died in the Bastille in November of 1703 and was buried under a false name, his true identity, per explicit instruction, never to be recorded or revealed. Why would the government of Louis XIV invest such extraordinary, sustained effort into concealing one man's identity for decades at the very center of French state power? This is the question that has driven centuries of speculation, much of it eventually intersecting with the House of Bourbon itself. The most enduring and widely circulated theory, popularized significantly by the writings of Voltaire and later Alexandre Dumas, proposes that the masked prisoner was in fact a secret older brother of Louis XIV, born to Queen Anne of Austria under circumstances the crown wished never to become public, whether through illegitimate parentage or a suppressed birth order that would have complicated the succession. Under this theory, the mask served not merely to conceal a criminal's identity, but to prevent any possibility of the prisoner's face becoming publicly associated with the royal Bourbon features that might have raised uncomfortable, potentially destabilizing questions about the legitimacy of Louis's own claim to the throne. Mainstream historians, working from surviving prison correspondence and administrative records, have generally proposed considerably less dramatic explanations. The most widely supported candidate is a man named Eustache Dauger, a valet whose exact offense remains unclear from surviving records, but who appears repeatedly in correspondence discussing prisoners requiring exceptional secrecy, suggesting his significance may have derived less from royal blood and more from sensitive knowledge, perhaps political or diplomatic in nature, that made his ability to speak freely a genuine liability to individuals in positions of considerable power. This more restrained explanation, however, has never fully displaced the royal theories in the public imagination, and it is here, moving beyond the immediate question of the prisoner's own identity, that a stranger and more speculative thread emerges. Claims, persisting since at least the 18th century, that the masked prisoner did not die entirely without issue, that during his years of relatively comfortable, closely guarded confinement, he may have fathered a child, whether through a relationship with a guard's family member or some other arrangement never fully documented, and that this child was quietly raised elsewhere under a different name, carrying forward a bloodline that official French history had gone to such extraordinary lengths to erase. Is there credible documentary evidence supporting such a claim? Historians researching this specific thread have generally found the evidence thin at best, resting largely on later genealogical claims made by families seeking to establish a connection to royal or near-royal blood, claims that proliferated across Europe in the decades and centuries following the Revolution, when established aristocratic lineages had been so thoroughly disrupted that unconventional, difficult-to-verify origin stories occasionally found more receptive audiences than they might have in earlier, more rigidly documented eras. Several European families, across multiple generations, have at various points claimed descent from the man in the iron mask, their genealogical arguments typically resting on a combination of circumstantial timing, family oral tradition, and occasionally physical resemblance to portraits of the Bourbon line, evidence that modern historians generally regard as suggestive at best, and entirely unprovable given the deliberate, extraordinarily thorough concealment surrounding the prisoner's true identity in the first place. Without knowing definitively who the masked prisoner actually was, establishing a verified bloodline extending from him becomes, by definition, a genealogical claim built upon an unresolved foundation, however sincerely believed by those making it. And yet, why has this particular thread of speculation proven so durable, persisting even among families with little practical benefit to gain from an unprovable and largely unverifiable royal connection in the modern era? Perhaps because the case of the man in the iron mask represents something rarer than most mysteries explored in this series. Not simply an unexplained death or disappearance, but a deliberate, successful, multi-decade campaign by one of history's most powerful monarchies to erase a single man's identity so thoroughly that even the full resources of modern historical research have never definitively recovered it. If a government could accomplish that, the reasoning seems to follow. What else might it have been capable of concealing, including the quiet continuation of a bloodline officials had every reason to ensure never surfaced? Modern genetic testing, the tool that has helped bring at least partial resolution to other mysteries in this exploration, remains largely inapplicable here, given that no remains definitively linked to the masked prisoner have ever been identified or exhumed. His burial having been conducted, in keeping with the secrecy that defined his entire imprisonment, under a false name in a grave whose precise location, like so much else about the man himself, was never meant to be found. What remains, more than 3 centuries later, is a mask, a name history never confirmed, a jailer whose extraordinary discretion outlasted his prisoner by decades, and a scattering of families across Europe whose claimed connection to that hidden man can neither be proven nor entirely dismissed. Was the man in the iron mask truly a secret brother to the Sun King? His existence and any descendants he may have left behind, a threat carefully managed for generations after his death? Or was he simply a valet who knew too much, his mask concealing nothing more extraordinary than an ordinary man caught in the machinery of state secrecy? His supposed royal bloodline nothing more than a story too compelling for history to ever fully let go of. the Bastille itself no longer stands, torn down during the very revolution that would later scatter the remains of the dynasty this masked man may or may not have belonged to. What he took with him into that unmarked grave has never been recovered, and perhaps, after 3 centuries of searching, it never will be. We end this exploration where American Gothic literature itself would eventually find so much of its darkest material, with a son, Edgar Allan Poe, whose entire body of work seems, in retrospect, haunted by a loss he was almost too young to consciously remember, and a mother whose final months remain nearly as obscured as any mystery we have covered tonight. Richmond, Virginia, in the winter of 1811, was home to a small but active theater community, the kind of city where traveling performers regularly pass through on regional circuits. It was here, in a modest rented room, that a young actress named Elizabeth Arnold Poe died in December of that year, at only 24, leaving behind 3 small children, including a 2-year-old son named Edgar. The verified facts describe a life of near-constant instability. Elizabeth had performed on stage since childhood, a profession that carried real social stigma for women in this era. She married actor David Poe Jr., and the family moved frequently, chasing theatrical engagements that offered little security. By 1811, her husband had reportedly abandoned the family, and Elizabeth, now alone with 3 young children, continued performing even as her health visibly declined, likely from tuberculosis, until she was too ill to work at all. This pattern, tragic as it is, was not unusual for the period. What makes her case genuinely uncertain is how little of it was ever carefully documented at the time. The precise progression of her illness, the exact conditions of her final weeks, even the specific location of her death within Richmond, have never been established through reliable primary sources, historians relying instead on scattered playbills, brief newspaper notices, and later biographical accounts written by people who never knew her, working decades after the fact. Edgar Allan Poe himself rarely spoke of his mother in any detail, suggesting he may have inherited only fragments, second-hand impressions passed along by adults who barely knew her. Her grave was effectively lost for nearly a century, unmarked and unremarkable, until renewed interest in her son's growing literary reputation prompted a formal memorial in Richmond's Shockoe Hill Cemetery, long after any documentary certainty about her death could realistically be restored. From here, the more speculative threads concern not the fact of her death, but its imprint on the writer she left behind. Some literary scholars have proposed, carefully and without claiming documented proof, that the recurring image of a beautiful, dying woman running through so much of Poe's later work, from Annabel Lee to Ligeia to The Fall of the House of Usher, may trace back to this early, barely remembered loss, an absence so incomplete in the historical record that Poe may have spent his creative life quietly trying to fill in what fact could never fully supply. Is that a fair reading, or a retroactive projection onto a woman whose real life remains only partially recoverable? Reasonable scholars land on both sides, and the honest answer likely sits somewhere in between. What survives, over 2 centuries later, is a grave that took 100 years to properly mark, a handful of playbills bearing her name, and a son whose entire literary legacy would return, again and again, to the very themes of loss and incomplete mourning that his earliest, least documented years had already written into him. From the theaters of Richmond, we travel now to the opposite end of the Atlantic world entirely, north and east, across open ocean, to a cluster of remote, wind-battered islands off the coast of Scotland, where the sea itself seems to have kept secrets longer than any single human lifetime could account for. The Flannan Isles sit roughly 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, a scattering of small, uninhabited islands in the North Atlantic, so exposed to the elements that even now they remain accessible only by boat, and only when weather allows. Most accounts of mystery surrounding these islands begin in December of 1900, when 3 lighthouse keepers stationed there vanished without explanation, their lighthouse found still operational, their table set as if for a meal never eaten, no trace of the men ever recovered. That case alone has fueled more than a century of speculation. But long before 1900, the Flannan Isles already carried a reputation, one rooted in older Scottish and Hebridean folklore, that some researchers argue may have quietly shaped how the later disappearance was understood, interpreted, and remembered. The verified historical record here is admittedly thin, resting more on oral tradition than documented fact. The islands were known locally for generations before the lighthouse was ever built, as a place governed by unusual customs and caution. Shepherds who occasionally grazed sheep there were said to follow specific rituals upon landing, removing their caps, addressing the islands with formal respect, and avoiding certain phrases considered unlucky, practices some folklorists connect to older beliefs that the islands were the dwelling place of powerful, otherworldly beings, deserving of the same wary deference sailors traditionally showed the sea itself. Why would a scattering of small rocky islands accumulate this particular kind of reputation? Some historians point to the island's genuine, practical danger: violent, unpredictable weather, treacherous currents, and a long, quiet history of small fishing vessels that simply never returned from waters near the Isles, losses common enough across the region's maritime history that they would plausibly, over generations, calcify into cautionary folklore without requiring anything more mysterious than the ordinary, considerable risks of North Atlantic seafaring. But do ordinary maritime dangers fully account for the specificity of the older traditions surrounding the Isles? Traditions that speak not simply of danger, but of a place where things, and occasionally people, are said to disappear entirely, leaving no trace behind it all. Local folklore recorded well before the 1900 lighthouse incident includes scattered references to earlier, undocumented disappearances connected to the islands. Stories passed down primarily through oral tradition among Hebridean communities, difficult to verify through any surviving written record, yet strikingly consistent in their central theme: that something about these particular islands did not release what it took. When the 3 lighthouse keepers vanished in 1900, some islanders and mainland Scots reportedly responded not with total shock, but with a kind of grim recognition, treating the disappearance as confirmation of a pattern the islands had always been rumored to hold, rather than as an entirely unprecedented event. Official investigators at the time focused reasonably on practical explanations: a rogue wave sweeping the men from the landing area during a storm, an accident during routine maintenance, explanations consistent with the isolated, hazardous conditions of any remote lighthouse posting. This remains the mainstream, most scientifically grounded explanation today. Yet the older folklore surrounding the Isles raises a quieter, more speculative question that modern investigators rarely address directly. Did centuries of pre-existing local belief about the islands shape how witnesses, investigators, and the broader public interpreted an otherwise explainable maritime accident, layering supernatural expectation onto what practical evidence suggests was simply a tragic, if genuinely unusual, accident? Or does the sheer consistency of older, independently sourced oral tradition, describing similar disappearances long before any lighthouse existed to draw national attention to the Isles at all, suggest something about the specific location itself that neither weather patterns nor probability alone comfortably explain? No physical evidence directly links the 1900 disappearance to these older traditions, and most serious historians treat the connection as, at best, an atmospheric parallel rather than a documented causal link. The island's genuinely hazardous conditions provide more than sufficient explanation on their own, without requiring recourse to older folklore for either case. Still, the pattern persists, however loosely connected across centuries. What remains, beyond the well-documented 1900 case, is a scattering of older oral traditions, difficult to date precisely, impossible to verify through any surviving written record, describing a place where the ordinary rules of expected return did not always seem to apply. Did generations of Hebridean islanders develop these customs and stories simply as a practical, culturally encoded warning about a genuinely dangerous stretch of ocean? Or did they preserve, in the only form available to a largely oral culture, the memory of something about those specific islands that has never been fully explained, then or now? The lighthouse still stands today, automated and unmanned, its light sweeping across water that has never offered any further answers than it did in 1900, or, if the older stories are to be believed, for however long before that the Flannan Isles had already been quietly claiming what the sea chose never to give back.